I am joined today on the podcast by Michelle Newell. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Emma.
Hi. And we are going to be talking today about storytelling, the importance of storytelling, how to do it, why to do it, when to do it, where to do it, all things storytelling. Before we get into that, Michelle, do you want to start by giving us a bit of an overview of you and your career to date and how you now find yourself as a storyteller?
As a storyteller, yes. Well, first of all, I don't think my job title should be storyteller. I think it should be professional chameleon, because I have had so many different official job titles, which I can tell you about shortly, because I think it has all contributed to where I am now. So I have a consulting business called the Storytelling Business, and I specialize in writing stories for businesses, whether that's client stories or business backstories. But more so, the work that I do now is actually teaching people how to be storytellers and how to tell either their own personal or professional stories, or to tell the stories of the business that they work for. But back to that professional chameleon,
I like that
idea. Yeah. I could have gone with jack of all trades, but I think professional chameleon.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I
There's a
actually
much better
think
story behind professional.
there is a better story behind it. And you immediately see the colours of a chameleon, and it conveys a message.
Yeah.
But I think to be a good storyteller, you do have to be a chameleon in a way, because a chameleon reshapes and restructures themselves to fit different narratives. And this is how I approach storytelling when I teach people storytelling. We talk about the fact that there's lots of angles you could take with the different ideas that you have, with different projects you're working on, different services you offer. But how do you craft that into something that's going to really connect with your audience and mean something to them? So I love that chameleon idea.
Yeah.
Um,
And have you always been a writer? Have you always been in comms and that's kind of led you down that path?
Yes and no. I say I've always been a writer because as a kid, I was one of those kids who wrote and illustrated her own little mini books. I should have grabbed them out of the the garage so I could hold them up and show you. I've still got them.
Nice.
And they're all plagiarized from Enid Blyton and Beatrix Potter. There's talking rabbits and things like that. But yeah, I always knew from a young age that I wanted to be a writer. And my parents used to tell me, you can't make money from being a writer. But I didn't listen, and I started a journalism degree. But I was from a country town in Queensland, and I moved to the big city alone by myself. And I was actually only 17 the first year that I was at uni, 16 turning 17. And I was this little fish in a big pond doing a journalism degree with some very talented people. And I lost my confidence, and I thought, I can't do this. I can't be a storyteller. And I would have to read things aloud in a class, in a tutorial, and I'd just think, oh, my stuff sounds so unsophisticated. And I really lost my confidence. I thought, no, I can't do this. So I ended up becoming a high school English teacher.
Wow.
And I did love that, but it wasn't my passion. I'd always wanted to be a writer. And so to reinvent myself, here's the first phase of being a chameleon. I moved to London, because that's what you used to do when you wanted to reinvent yourself. You went to London, you were far away from family and what people knew of you in Australia, and you could be anything you wanted to be. So I actually ended up working as a school designer with architects.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
And we did a lot of human-centered design, which you hear a lot about across different industries now.
Yeah.
And the focus was really on how do we create spaces that we can shape around the people who use them. So I was the first point of call for teachers and students and school leaders, and I would go in and work with them to craft a design brief for this school. So no architects were even in the picture yet. They were waiting in the background. And we would talk about, what are the challenges that you're having currently? These were very deprived areas of England that we were working in as well. So, for example, we had some schools with bullet holes in the front fence. Yeah. So these were tough areas, and this was an opportunity to really help them reimagine a different kind of future. And Yeah, so that was a fabulous training ground, I think, for me, for storytelling later on with this
Yeah.
human-centered design. Because when you tell a story, you're always putting one
Mm.
person at the center of it and building your story out around them. Um, and at this time, I was also immersing myself in stories. So I was designing and building schools for about 8 years, and I was doing that on a project basis. So I had
Mhm.
spare time, and I studied for postgrad in museum studies, and then another one in arts management. And I
So
started.
eclectic. I
I
love
know,
this.
I know. But it was fabulous because I got to meet so many different kinds of people and hear
Yeah.
so many different kinds of stories and really
Yeah.
adapt my skills to different environments. So I was working with museums and galleries. And then I was so lucky to be a co-curator of the first Australia-New Zealand Literature Festival that was run in London, and it was funded by both governments. And we brought over some incredible writers, Christos Tolkos, who wrote The Slap, which was turned into a TV series, Anita Heiss, who's an amazing Indigenous writer. She does Indigenous chick lit, which is really unique. Bruce Pascoe is a really powerful Indigenous voice as well and writer. Documentary filmmakers like John Pilger. So I was just immersed
Mm.
with these storytellers, and I actually started writing my own novel. I drafted a novel. I got an agent in London as well. Don't get excited. It's unpublished.
That was
It will
going to be my
remain
next question.
unpublished. No. Oh, you don't realize how hard it is to write a novel until you start. I worked on it for 7 years. I rewrote it 3 times.
I
And
can't even imagine.
oh,
My brain just doesn't work
yeah.
like that.
Yeah. And I lost my momentum. But again, I was going to writing workshops and conferences. I went to LA, to New York, London, learning a lot about crafting stories.
Mm.
And so what I bring today to the storytelling workshop I do with people is a real creative flair. How do we tell a story like it's a movie? How do we create these mini movies in people's minds when they hear your story? Um,
That's
yeah,
fabulous. I
and
love that
eventually,
story. Yeah.
oh, thanks. Eventually, I came back to Australia and found myself in a marketing role. I did have a marketing role as well in London. I was working on a big urban regeneration project that came off the back of doing the school
Mm.
design. So that was my first official comms role, but no official marketing degree or comms degree. I just sort of fell into it because of my range of
Mm.
experience. And I got another marketing job as a marketing manager of a girls' school here in Melbourne. And then I became a writer and comms manager at Picture Partners, professional services firm. Was marketing manager at a design college. And then I've since gone out on my own with the storytelling business. So it's a really eclectic
Mm.
professional background, but I always say that people and story are sort of the unifying
Yeah.
features.
Yeah, and you can absolutely see that. And what I particularly like about that is I think it's so easy for people to fall into the trap of this kind of cookie cutter, kind of one size fits all, your career should look like this. And if
Mm,
it doesn't, it's somehow, quote unquote wrong. And
yeah.
I really, do not like that train of thought at all. And I think your story demonstrates that so perfectly of these different experiences
Mm,
that are so on the surface quite different, but as you said, there's a common theme that kind of links them all.
yeah.
And maybe I say that because I'm slightly biased because my own career probably looks a bit like that too. And I always say that the common theme in mine is people and kind of wanting to
Mm,
help people, although from the outside it probably doesn't necessarily look like that. But I think it's just a really important point of it doesn't have to be this kind of cookie cutter linear
no.
journey, that you whatever that journey looks like, you learn so many different things along the way. And I
Yeah.
also like slightly selfishly that London was a key point in that
Oh,
story.
my heart is still in London
Mine
after
too.
9 years back. But I must say, Emma, about your sort of potted history, as you say, and mine, it could look messy if we didn't tell the story right. And
That's
I've
very true.
I've worked and worked on my story a lot, and I do a lot of work with thought leaders on their personal brand and their brand story. And you can tell the story so it looks like a mess, so that you look like you're terribly unemployable because you only last 2 years in each job, or you can reshape that story to show how you were seeking your passion and you found it. And so it's all in the
100%.
spin.
It is, and it's something actually that I say to candidates quite often when they have a career history that maybe isn't immediately obvious kind of where they were going with it, and you can hear that they're a little bit hesitant and a little bit
Yeah.
nervous, and that's always my advice is find the story, find
Yeah.
the common themes, and don't just kind of say, and then I was here and then I went there. Join it together, tell a story with it. And yeah, inadvertently, I guess that's
Yeah.
what I've done with
Great
my
advice.
with
Yeah.
my own without realizing.
Yeah.
When it comes to storytelling, I feel it's one of those I was going to say phrases, not a phrase, a word, that it is you hear it a lot at the moment, and
Yeah.
but I wonder whether it's a word that kind of we're all using without necessarily really understanding it, and
Absolutely.
what kind of what goes into making that. So do you want to
Mm.
kind of give us a, yeah, why is what is storytelling in its true
Yeah.
sense, and kind of why it's so important?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because you're right. It's a real buzzword at the moment,
Mm,
and everyone's talking about
that's
storytelling
the
and
phrase I
telling
was searching
stories.
for,
And
and I couldn't
yeah,
think
yeah,
buzzword. Yeah.
buzzword, buzzword. But yeah, we could go into a bit more detail about that if you
Mm,
like, because
please.
I think when people talk about stories and storytelling, I think what they're often really talking about is just content. Do a blog post, do
Yeah.
some social media posts, and that might be it might be a great idea. It might be a really interesting blog post, but it's not necessarily a story, because stories follow a certain trajectory. You think of your classic narrative arc, which is what it's called, and the story rises to a point of tension and then falls to a resolution. So a story isn't a story unless there's some growth and some challenge and some change. And I'll go into more detail about that maybe a little bit later, but I think just in terms of the value of storytelling, we
Mm,
definitely need it, and I think we can all do it better. It's not just this sort of pretty nice add-on. I think it should be really central to your marketing and your internal comms, because storytelling is actually, there's a really strong scientific foundation for why it engages people. It really captures their hearts and their minds and
mm,
forms a connection with the audience when they hear the story.
yeah.
And they've done brain scans of people while they're hearing stories, and they've also tested their blood. And what they find is when you hear a story on that classic narrative arc where you have one central character, which we call the protagonist, and you have an antagonist, which is the enemy. And I'll talk a bit more about an enemy in a minute, because it might not be a big competitor, or it might not be the person sitting at the desk next to you, but you have an enemy, and then you have something that you're striving for and a challenge to overcome. When people hear a story like that, a few things happen. You get dopamine released in your brain, and that's pleasure and attention. So you get people sitting up on the edge of their seat and they're really listening to the story. And you get cortisol as well. When we think of cortisol as being associated with stress, but it also sort of gets you ready for action.
Mm,
And you've got oxytocin, which has been called the love chemical, or it's a trust
yeah.
chemical. And then endorphins, we all know what they are. You feel good, especially when you get this sort of good resolution at the end. So scientists have even brought people into rooms, given them some money, got them to watch a film of a sick child and the father of it with the sick child, just a little cartoon,
Mm,
and they can predict, based on how the story is told, how much money people will donate to a charity, say a cancer charity, if that's the illness the
wow.
child has,
Yeah.
after they watch the film. So you can see why it makes good marketing sense if people are going to part
Yeah.
with their money when they really feel connected and invested.
Yeah, actually had no idea in terms of
Mm,
those yeah, scientific kind of physiological responses. I guess the thing that was
yeah.
in my head was, is it somehow related to a just memories of childhood, or even, you know, just something simple like that? But yeah, I had no idea that there was so much kind of underpinning it.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that happens is something called neural coupling.
Hmm.
And it's important when you tell a story to always just have one main character. So it might be your client, it might be a staff member, But you don't want to have multiple characters when you tell your story. You want to have one. And that's because what you're trying to do is get this neural coupling to happen where the person taking in the story, hearing it or reading it, their brain patterns start to match the character in the story, and they start to really feel a connection with them. It sounds crazy, but the science is there.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Mm.
Can anyone be a good storyteller?
Yeah, good question. Well, I freaked out and thought that I couldn't be a storyteller, and I'd got into a journalism degree, so someone obviously thought I could tell a story. But absolutely, I think storytelling is just a skill like anything else that we might learn, like how to do a social media post, the technical side of that. And I mean, incredible storytelling. Some people are naturally talented and they're always going to tell a better story than we can, great novelists. But if you follow that narrative structure, you can definitely tell a really great story. And when I work with people, I give them a very clear framework. So I take away as much of the thinking as possible and really step them through. Say it's a project and they want to tell the story of their project success. And I'll take them through a series of steps to show them that once you break it down into this happened and then that happened and then that happened, and it really is, it is a skill that you can learn. And of course, with ChatGPT now, there are no excuses for not drafting up your story or finessing your story. So
and I when you sort of say it from initially, tell a story, I think it feels a bit big, and particularly I never think of myself as being a particularly creative person. So if someone says something like that, I immediately think, oh, how am I going to do that? But if you've got those kind of steps of chunk it down, make it more accessible, can you sort of talk us through those stages?
Those stages, yeah, sure. So you want to have a hook to start your story. So something that's going to really grab people's attention. And that might be, sometimes you read a novel and they tell you, you get the little prologue where they give you a little hint of what's to come. So it might be something along those lines, or it might be a big question or a big challenge that you put out to your audience. But then you start with the setup, and the setup involves sort of setting the scene for people. So who's the main character and what's the scenario that we're in at the moment? And then, so let's say we're telling the story of a project, for example, and it might be, so we started on this project, we were really enthusiastic and excited about it, but then we hit an obstacle. We always need to have an obstacle or a challenge to overcome, because that's what starts.
That's the villain, as you said.
Yeah. And that villain might be, like for me, with worrying about, I can't do journalism, I can't be a writer. I was my own villain, my mindset, my insecurities and my fears. That's what held me back. So that's what I was talking about earlier when I said it doesn't have to be this external force, your competitor, the person sitting at the desk next to you who might be getting the promotion, not you. It can be yourself holding you back. And so you want to take people through a few steps of what you were working on in your project, what challenges you were facing, and then you have this point of climax. It's at the top of that arc. So what happened? What was the battle? If you think about a movie, it's always towards the end, there's this battle scene. Good usually triumphs over evil, but that's the main thing. Maybe you had to present to the board and the board had been so negative about your project so far, and you really thought that you weren't going to get this project over the line. And then you presented it and someone on the board started crying and told you their own personal journey of how the project, maybe not, but and then we start going back down. We take people back down emotionally into a resolution, some lessons learned, or looking ahead to what the next thing is. And you might be sitting there thinking, oh, no, there was no challenge in my journey, in my professional story, in my project story. Trust me, there will be. There is always something that we can find that will really help engage your audience and get them invested. Because what you want to do is get people invested in your success and in your outcome. And they don't do that if your story is just like linear, nothing happens. I did a marketing degree, I got a job at Google, and now I'm super happy.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Blah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I really love your point there about the antagonist, the villain, that it doesn't have to be an external factor. And so, and I'd imagine actually in a lot of instances, that sort of whatever that internal struggle is super emotive, because
Mm,
immediately people are putting themselves in your position and thinking, oh God, I've done
exactly.
that too. Like I've had
Yeah.
moments like that in my, I think we probably all have. So you've immediately, that sort of neuro coupling, I think you
Coupling.
called it,
Yep.
you've
Neural coupling.
immediately done
Yeah.
that and kind of brought the person in, and they're there with you. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah.
From a marketing perspective, and in the example you gave there with the projects, I can totally see how you would use
Mm,
that in that instance, and it makes sense. I guess, yeah, if we're thinking about storytelling specifically in kind of marketing content and campaigns, whatever it
yeah.
might be, yeah, can you give me some examples and ideas around how it then kind of weaves into that?
Yeah, definitely. I always say that there's a few standard stories that people should just have, businesses should have.
Mm,
So, um, the one that we usually always have is the about us story.
yeah,
And it's sort of a value story. This is what we stand for. But I think there's so many more stories we can have. And one that I absolutely love is the origin story.
yeah,
And that's often not included in the business backstory. The origin story is the one about how you got to where you are now. Where have you come from? What was the challenge that you faced in setting up your business, perhaps? And one of my favorite all-time origin stories, I didn't write it, but do you know Koyo? It's the alternative yogurt brand, or
I've
yogurt, we'll
heard of
say,
it, but
since
yeah,
we're
yes.
London lovers. So it's a coconut yogurt. And if you go to their website or my website, because I've done a brand story breakdown on
Mm,
them, the story of how it was started is just fabulous. They were the first to market with the coconut yogurt, so very different to what anyone else was doing. It's an Australian-owned, Queensland-owned company,
mm,
and the story talks about the man who came up with the idea, and he actually grew up on an island surrounded by coconuts. And so you immediately get this
yeah,
beautiful your visual in your mind when you read the story of where he's come from. And his challenge was being this first person in market. No one else had done it, and he was doing trial and error with a lot of the product. And then he was about to give it up. He just thought, no, can't set up this company. It's not going to happen. And he took a walk on the beach to clear his mind, and a coconut washed up at his feet. And this was, I think, in Queensland where there weren't a lot of
yeah,
coconuts. So he took it as a sign. I still get goosebumps when I think
yeah,
about that. Like,
yeah.
whoa, okay. So
I think the universe is definitely trying to tell you something there.
yeah, yeah. So that's beautiful. But the way that
Mm,
story is told, you can sense the business's values of natural products and commitment to the environment and alternative ways of living and being. You get it all coming through the origin story. So yeah, that's one I highly recommend people go seek out to
yeah,
see it, an origin story well done. And then
mm,
other stories for marketers would be your customer success stories. Um, you can write them like case studies, but I love them when they're written more as stories. So you're telling the story of your clients more than yourself. And you're just subtly weaving in what your business did to support the client to make them a
mm,
success. So you get the halo effect. Here's my incredible client, and I'm associated with them. So they're great, and I'm great too.
mm.
Employee stories, which I know we're going to talk about
Yes,
a little bit more soon because it's
yes,
something we're both interested in. And then product and service stories,
yeah,
that you're offering an action.
yeah,
How have you made an impact? And the other big one as well, social responsibility story. I
mm,
think that's really important now. It's something that's really emerging is businesses are looking to frame a story of how they're doing good for people and planet.
mm. And then I was thinking, as well, as you were giving the example before
Mm.
about the cartoon and the for the
Yes,
charity example.
yeah.
So even things like there's in terms of campaigns, there's ways to make a campaign more story based
Oh,
and emotive as a result of that.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We all, we say people buy from people.
Mm,
Um, and you want to find those stories that have these central characters for your campaigns. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
I think particularly from a B2B perspective, it's really important, isn't it? Because as you say, it's always that age-old kind of adage of people buy people, they don't buy products.
Yeah.
And if
Yep.
you're marketing your business as this kind of, just blob of people and talking in very broad terms, there's no
Yeah.
personal connection. So how do you find the more personal stories within that
Exactly.
B2B setting? And
Yeah.
like the yogurt example, so clear in that sort of origin story or about us story. And it's probably also, again, you mentioned it in that example, a really good way to talk about values, but in a more authentic way, rather than just,
Yeah.
here's us, these are our values. And
Yeah,
it's all a
exactly.
bit
How are you
cold.
living your values?
Yeah,
How are your employees living out your values? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and actually that, as we start talking about values, does lead very nicely into the other topic that we wanted to talk about, and storytelling is such a big part of, and that's around EVP, employee value
Yeah.
proposition. And it's one of these things that I find quite fascinating, actually, that obviously in my role I talk to a lot of marketers from a lot of different industries, and I'm always surprised that I talk to so few marketers who have been involved in helping to shape their organization's recruitment process, or whatever the talent acquisition process might look
Yeah.
like. Very few people have even got anywhere near being involved in an EVP process.
Yeah.
And I find that really surprising, because whilst there's obviously going to be a very heavy HR or talent acquisition element, so much of that to me is marketing. And
Yeah.
I've never kind of understood why more organizations don't involve marketers, even just in a very basic sense, as the voice of the customer in
Yeah.
that scenario, and kind of customer journeys.
Yeah.
And you think, sorry, I'm on my soapbox now. You think more broadly about the, let's be honest, not great reputation of recruitment as a whole. And so much of it is about the experience of the job seeker. And I just think there's such an opportunity for marketers to be involved and actually craft that as a,
Yeah.
quote unquote customer journey. And it would
Absolutely.
totally change the experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think marketers should be involved in everything. I know
yes.
sometimes it's a
Yeah.
controversial opinion, but your brand identity and your stories are conveyed through everything.
Mm,
It's every touch point of your business. So whether someone walks into your office and sits down in a chair, or the photos that you choose to use to represent your business, or what people say about the business, what staff say when they're
yeah,
just out and about at a
absolutely.
barbecue with friends.
Yeah.
Has marketing had a
Mm.
hand in helping to craft some of that, so that you've got this compelling and coherent narrative about what you stand for? It's really important.
Absolutely. I think it's just, and maybe it's just a narrow view of brand, or just a narrow view of, maybe it's a narrow view of who your customers are, and the avenues in which they're coming to you. That, on the one hand, think of large corporates, because it's probably an easier example, spending millions of dollars on advertising to attract a customer. And then in a separate scenario, someone
Yes.
comes to you as a job seeker who may already be a customer, and certainly is a potential customer, and you ignore them. You say, don't call us, we'll call you. You ghost them. All of these other things.
Yeah.
And it's staggering that on the
Yeah.
one hand you're spending millions, and then on the other hand you're ignoring them,
Yeah, there's a huge
essentially.
mismatch.
Oh,
There's
total
this, the public
disconnect.
message, and then you get to the inside and you're like, whoa, hang on a minute. This,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And
yeah.
then it's the follow-on of that. I remember speaking, it was last year actually, to a senior marketer, and I won't say the brand, but she'd applied to a large corporate, and was a customer, had had a fairly horrendous customer journey, let's call it, applying for a role. She herself is no longer a customer, and she went on to tell every single person she knew,
Wow.
including me,
Wow.
how bad this experience was.
Yeah.
And even just from that perspective, that the brand damage that's being
Mm.
done. Um, Yeah, sorry, soapbox.
Yeah.
I'll
No, but
I'll
it's
off.
interesting because I've been on the other side. I've been lucky enough to work with or for some organisations who do things very differently. So at Picture Partners, the recruitment team and the marketing team just happened to sit next to each other in the office. And maybe it was partly that. And we
Maybe
were
that's
very
what it was. Yeah,
friendly. So we
yeah,
always sort of knew what the other was working on. So
yeah.
we were able to produce a new employee recruitment campaign, and I wrote a lot of the content for the ads. And we worked together to tell the stories of people from different levels of the organisation and to make that the heart of the campaign. Here's our real staff, different stages of their professional journey. And we were able to convey the values of Picture Partners just through the stories of these staff without ever overtly saying, we stand for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And it was great because we had content that we could use for marketing, and they had content that they could use for advertising and recruitment fairs and onboarding packs. So the more you can work together, the more you have to share. And then, like you said, to have that consistent experience externally and internally.
Yeah. And I think there's, I mean, EVP more broadly, but obviously very important, but it just seems to me that storytelling just fits so perfectly into that scenario for a couple of reasons, because I think quite often companies misunderstand EVP and it becomes them, the organization, saying what the values are, and it's like, well, that's not it. That's, you know, that's your version of it, and it feels a little bit inauthentic or maybe even forced. Whereas I think as you said in that example, if you're you have your employees actually telling their own personal stories, so much more powerful, and immediately it's authentic, it's engaging, it's real, and so many levels on which you can tell those stories and things that you can talk about.
I think as well, the great thing about storytelling is it can help you to build your EVP in the beginning, and then you can use storytelling to help engage your staff and really bring that EVP to life. So the values piece is so essential at the beginning. You absolutely have to have your values and your messaging in place. Oh, I'm having a delivery at my door. I'm so sorry. And my dog is going crazy.
I actually can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
No.
Oh, good. So what are we talking about? Core values and messaging. So yeah, you have to have those values and messages in place from the beginning. And then you can also use storytelling to map out different employee journeys. What does it look like to be an employee at different stages? And you can also make personas, if you like. You can create fake employee personas, but you can work internally to say, these are the kind of people we really want to attract, and this would be their story so far and where they're heading with us. So there's great ways to use storytelling as a workshop and creative tool to frame your EVP, and then you can use it to engage your staff. So as we just talked about earlier, telling their stories, celebrating their wins, not just using their stories to show this is what we stand for and these are our values, but using it to show that they are making an impact with your clients and customers. And
I think the key point there, as you said, is actually those workshops at the beginning to help identify the stories. So again, it's genuine, it's real, it's authentic, it's coming from employees, as opposed to, I don't know, a head of people and culture or a head of marketing saying, these are our values, these are the things we're going to talk about. And I think that's often the bit interesting. We did another episode last year with Simon McSorley all about EVP and kind of how you go about it, and that was one of his key points that people often miss. They skip that step and go straight to what they think the offering is, and don't have that kind of information gathering workshop stage at the beginning, which maybe, I don't know, it feels a bit brave, you know, to kind of put it, just step back and put it in the hands of your people, essentially. And maybe that's why some people don't do it. But
you could be opening a can of worms. You could be hearing things that you don't want to hear. So it is brave, but I think you could do one of two things. You could look at that as a way to actually address some of the concerns that
Absolutely.
staff have.
Yeah.
Or you could potentially handpick people to be involved in the process,
Yeah.
who you think might give you more
Mm.
of the information
Yeah.
that's on track with what you think the company's about. But
Yeah, and I think particularly for topics like, I mean, you mentioned sort of social responsibility earlier. One of them, certainly diversity and inclusion. I think topics where storytelling from the individual is so important. I think we've all seen examples where an organization is talking about diversity and inclusion, and it's a very non-diverse person who's delivering that message,
yes,
and it just feels there's a disconnect.
yeah.
You know, and I don't know if you're there's a video perhaps talking about how diverse your organization is, and the video is not showing a diverse group of people. Again, it just falls flat. Whereas
Yeah,
if
it
they're,
doesn't ring true.
no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're real stories, similarly things I think like I mean, flexibility, obviously a massive topic more broadly at the moment.
Mm,
Is it a, you know, is it a sentence on your website saying we offer flexibility, or is it a story of
yeah,
perhaps a working parent talking through how they balance their work
exactly.
and
And what
life?
their challenges were and how that
Mm.
flexibility has helped them overcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, but with the diversity topic, it's really interesting because when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, it's so important to give people a voice in that space, people who have been sidelined and silenced in the past. So I recently ran a workshop for a law firm during Pride, actually, which was really fun, for their
Mm.
LGBTQI plus staff from around
Mm.
Asia Pac. And we looked at teaching them to find and share their own stories so that they had the confidence, but also the platform to be able to share what their experience had been in the legal industry. So, yeah, I'm a real advocate for teaching people to tell their own stories. Also because personal branding is really big now as well. But if you can help staff invest in their own personal brand by teaching them to tell their story, they're going to be more active on social media, and that's going to reflect back on you as the employer. They've got this fabulously talented staff working for us and
Mm.
sharing what you're doing as an organization. So
There's been
it's
a
a
real
win-win.
shift. Yeah, there's been a real shift there, hasn't there? I mean, I can remember
Mm.
actually when I first moved to Australia, which was probably what, 11 and a half years ago. And when I first started, did a lot of work in digital and creative, and had a Twitter account. I actually had a personal Twitter and I had a work Twitter account. And
Uh-huh.
the two never met, like they were
Yeah.
totally separate. And it sounds quite funny now in retrospect that there were these kind of two versions.
Mm.
Um,
I do still have two Instagram accounts, and I sometimes think, oh, it feels weird. I want to work out how to merge them and be this
yeah,
one holistic person.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it? And I think that move to more, I've said it quite a few times, but I say it again, more authentic,
Mm.
real content and human stories kind of being at the core of that, rather than these sort of slightly corporate robot type stories.
Oh, it's so important. Like yesterday, I bought yoga blocks. I love yoga blocks. I need them for my neck. And I went online to buy them, and I found two sets that looked very similar from two different companies, both eco-friendly. And I went straight to the About Us pages of the companies because I wanted to know, who am I buying from? What's their story? How did they start up? And one was very corporate, the About Us story, or we do this and this. And the other one said, we're a small company based on the Mornington Peninsula. It's like a husband-wife team. This is why we started the company. And I'm Gen X, and we don't do that as much. But the
Mm,
generations coming through now,
yeah.
Gen Z and Alpha, they are
Mm.
looking at your stories and they want to know what you stand for and that you're living out your values, or they're not going to buy from you.
Yeah, it's really true, isn't it? And I also think as part of that, there has been a shift. Shift's the wrong word, but there used to be something, we used to trust perhaps big corporate more, whereas if it was a
Mm,
small business and it was the husband and wife, you know, working out of their garage, that would have, I think, been perceived as a negative at a
yeah,
point in time.
true,
Whereas
true.
now it's actually the opposite. Those are
Yeah,
the stories that we actually gravitate towards, and
yeah.
I think it's great for small business, because I think
Mm,
it's perhaps easier for small business to quote unquote win on some of those stories, because
Yeah.
it is very personal, because it may only be one or two people, one or two founders
Mhm.
in that instance.
And they were more expensive as well. That small business in
Yeah,
Mornington was $10 more expensive, not that much, but
yeah,
still.
yeah,
And I still went with them because of
yeah,
the story. So,
yeah. It's really
yeah, it's
true, isn't it?
powerful.
Yeah, the other question I had, just as you were saying before about, identifying people within the organisation and telling their stories. Do you ever come across scenarios where people are reluctant to tell their stories, or feel
Yeah,
maybe they don't,
absolutely.
would they feel a bit vulnerable, or
Yeah.
how do you approach that
Yeah,
type of
it definitely comes up because I think we
yeah,
hear a lot these days on social media that you need to be vulnerable. You've got to open up. And I think some people have taken that vulnerability too far. You don't have to share anything that you don't feel comfortable
mm,
sharing and that you don't want to share. You can still be real without, opening the closet and
yeah,
revealing all of your most secretive of secrets. So it's just about working out what you feel comfortable sharing, what you're happy for people to know, um, and just telling the story on your terms, not being forced to reveal too much. What I've found though over the last few years, the more that I've shared, the more that I've felt comfortable sharing more and more about myself, because you realize as you begin to share little bits that actually people do respond
mm,
um, more authentically back to you when you're more real. So nowadays, my LinkedIn's gotten a little bit political, a bit feminist, but I've found that that's actually attracting the kind of people to me
yeah,
who I want to work with.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I think you can start small, you can start safe, and you can build out from there after you see what the impact is.
yeah.
Mm.
Final question, Michelle.
Yes.
It's always our final question here.
Mhm.
What do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Yeah, I've had to think about this, and I think it is that you'll always find an audience for your story. I found an audience for my stories. I thought it was about me having to be a good storyteller, but you got to stop thinking about yourself and know that there is an audience out there. Maybe that's your clients or some ideal colleagues or professionals you want to engage with. Um, People will hear your story if it's the right story for them, and you'll naturally find that they want to listen. So think less about yourself, Michelle, and more about your audience. That's what I wanted over time. Yeah.
I love that. Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your story and
Thank you, Emma.
taking the time to share your experience, your story, and really, really interesting. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope it just sparks some creativity in whoever's listening, and they go
Yeah,
away and rethink storytelling and how they can use
absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. I know I will.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.